We're going to go live right now.
All right. Good morning to the Westminster class at Christ Presbyterian Church. I'm Jay Case, professor of history at Malone University, and we are talking about Christianity through history. And today we get to the 18th century, primarily the 18th century in America. Now, when I do this with my class called Religion in America at Malone, I give my students a group quiz. They will not be graded on it, but I give them points, and the points don't matter. It's like, whose line is it anyway? If I were live with in class with all of you folks, I might give you a group quiz, but we're online, and so we have to do things a little bit differently. So you'll just have to play at home, and I'll tell you if you get the answers right, what grade or how many points you would get. Let's just put it that way. So here's question number one on the group quiz, and it involves a picture here. Who is this person? Yes, you all got it right. That is, of course, Benjamin Franklin. Very good. You all get 10 points because I'm sure that you all got that right. All right, here's the second question. Who is this? Now, this is a lot more difficult, and in my class, most of my students do not know who this is. However, there are a couple that actually read the syllabus or looked carefully at the book that I assigned and determined that this really is Jonathan Edwards. And you may be in that group because you saw something about Edwards in the tidings or something like that, and so you got that correct. And if you did, you can give yourselves 150 points. But here's a question about these two men. What do we know about them? And I'm sure you all could come up with many, many things for Benjamin Franklin. He was at the Constitutional Convention, the Second Continental Congress, when they issued the Declaration of Independence. He was an ambassador to France. He was a printer, Poor Richard's Almanac. He had great phrases like early to bed, early to rise, makes a man wealthy, healthy, wealthy, and wise. Fish and house guests all smell after 3 days, things like that. He was very civic minded, established a fire station and a post office and a reading club. He was a scientist and sort of had these inventions, the bifocals and the Franklin stove, and one of my favorite flippers, that sort of thing. Jonathan Edwards, what do you know about him? Well, you'd score a lot lower on this, my guess is. And what happens, I'll tell you, typically in my class is my class is usually stumped, and I usually have a couple people who say, "There's that sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," and I'm like, "Yes, that is Jonathan Edwards." And then after that, it's really tough to know what Jonathan Edwards is all about. But here's what I want to do this morning. I want to compare these two for a couple of different reasons. One of them is that they represent two different reactions to developments that were taking place in American culture, actually Western culture, really Europe and North American culture in the 18th century, and developments that are still with us in certain sort of ways. So here's a couple things about Jonathan Edwards and Benjamin Franklin, and that is they were actually similar in some ways. And most people do not think of these two men as similar. In fact, we're more likely to think that Jonathan Edwards came much earlier than Benjamin Franklin and was older. But take a look at this. Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706. Jonathan Edwards in 1703. They were actually contemporaries. Now, one reason why Benjamin Franklin seems more recent is that he was very good at not dying. Which means he lived quite a while until he was 84, which was a long time for that period. And Jonathan Edwards died before the Revolutionary era in his 50s. He died, by the way, there was a smallpox epidemic, and he took an inoculation, and he actually insisted that his whole family and all his grandchildren get inoculated. And they all survived, but his dosage was a little bit off, and so he died of smallpox. Anyway, so that's one aspect. But here's the other thing about Benjamin Franklin and Jonathan Edwards. They both came from Puritan New England. Both had parents and grandparents who were dedicated, devout Puritans. And they were both very, very bright, very, very intelligent. Benjamin Franklin picked up a lot of his knowledge kind of on his own and hanging around his brother's printing office and then reading on his own. Jonathan Edwards went to Yale and studied to be a minister, but they both read the leading texts of the day, I guess you should say. And that's going to be important for what we talk about this morning. I have one more question about these two, though. Benjamin Franklin is, of course, very, very famous. If you had AP College poll rankings of the founders and what place you would put them in, I think Franklin comes in third place. Washington is first, Jefferson is second, then Franklin, and then after him you've got Hamilton and Jefferson and John Adams maybe. Jonathan Edwards, not so much. But here's an interesting question. Why is Franklin so famous? I mean, we've talked about all these things he did, but think about the things he didn't do. He was not a president. He really was not the mastermind behind the Constitution. That was James Madison. He didn't write the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson did. He was a diplomat, but so was John Jay. John Jay's not really famous. Really what it comes down to with Franklin, I think some of this can be exemplified by a summary from PBS special. He was one of the most extraordinary human beings the world has ever known. Born into the family of a Boston candle maker, Benjamin Franklin became the most famous American of his time. He helped found a new nation and defined the American character, writer, inventor, diplomat, businessman, musician, scientist, humorist, civic leader, international celebrity, genius. I think the key here is that he defined the American character, meaning that of all the people of the 18th century America, he seems the most similar to us today. He was kind of what we call, quote unquote, a self-made man, started out poor, made a lot of money. He wrote an autobiography in which he talked about rising up and sort of his own hard work bringing him success. In some ways, he's the first story of the American dream. And Americans love that sort of thing. Plus, he was kind of funny. People like funny people. Americans like funny people, I guess. But there are these, and he did all these different things as a writer, inventor, diplomat. He was well-rounded. And so this is how we Americans like to view ourselves. Jonathan Edwards, that sinners in the hands of an angry God thing, that's a little bit disturbing. A fire and brimstone preacher. In fact, that's how he's known in the latest musical Hamilton. By the little trivia here, Aaron Burr is Jonathan Edwards' grandson. And there's a line in one of Aaron Burr's songs where my grandfather was a fire and brimstone preacher. And that's pretty much what we know about Jonathan Edwards. A fire and brimstone preacher, sinners in the hands of an angry God, is the one thing that we know about him, mainly because literature classes very often use that sermon to exemplify. They say this is kind of like the Puritan mindset. And so Edwards seems like a man from an earlier day where, you're talking about God's judgment and hell, and a day in which people like Ben Franklin broke away from and, moved into a brighter day of progress in the American character. And yet that's an oversimplification. And this morning we want to talk a little more about both of these men and compare them. Let's give Jonathan Edwards a little more of his, a little more explanation. His biographer, George Marsden, said that Edwards was extraordinary, was by most estimate the most acute early American philosopher, the most brilliant of all theologians. The appeal of his thought endures. His celebrated biography of David Brainerd was the best-selling religious text in the 19th century America and encouraged countless Christians to seek lives of disinterested sacrifice and missionary service. An activist at the center of the most important religious and social movement of his day. What? What is that? But here's one thing about Jonathan Edwards. Most scholars today say, yeah, he is probably the most influential and the most important theologian that the United States or America, he, lived before America became the United States, but the most important theologian we've ever had. For that reason alone, we probably ought to pay a little more attention to him. And so that's what we are going to do this morning, is pay attention to Franklin and Edwards and trace both of them in terms of what they represent, and also a little bit on how they sort of played a role in promoting certain developments that are still with us today. Now, I should say one of the key developments that we have to face here is this a major development in the West called the Enlightenment, which you may be familiar with on some level. It's a very complex and complicated intellectual movement, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but it is very, very important. In fact, if you remember in an earlier class, Rabbi Komarovsky said that this has been a major tension within Judaism ever since in the last few centuries. And it's a major tension in Christianity. I mean, let's put it this way. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement, but it had huge implications for religion, and we've all been affected by it, whether we realize it or not. So let's unpack this a little bit about what we're talking about. I think that one way for our purposes to think about the Enlightenment is that it grows out of the scientific movement, scientific revolution. Isaac Newton combined measurements. We had instruments that could more accurately measure and examine really, really tiny things with microscopes, time with the pendulum clock, things that are really, really far away with the telescope, or temperature and air pressure. And what Newton did brilliantly, really, was take astronomy and physics and math together and showed that you could produce formulas that were very accurate and very, very predictable. And this is very, very new. I mean, science existed before this time, but he showed that, you have laws in the universe, gravity, and in these laws, for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. You could measure speed, and you could have extremely accurate predictability in terms of, repeatability, and in terms of measurement, which will later lead to a lot of very, very important developments. Now, that's science. What happens in the Enlightenment is that you take these principles and you have this modern way of thinking. You observe very, very precisely, you experiment, you bring out general laws of the universe, and eventually, in terms of on the science side of things, you're going to be able to develop things like the steam engine, which then for steamboats and railroads and all kinds of things is going to lead to incredible developments in the Industrial Revolution. But the Enlightenment did more. They took this scientific movement, and thinkers started applying it to human society. And that's where we have implications for religion. So, for instance, what do we do with natural phenomena? What the Enlightenment thinkers said is, look, you can, with science, we can determine that earthquakes, hurricanes, or good weather can be explained by natural causes, not God's judgment. Because in the centuries before this, the Puritans, for example, Franklin and Edwards' grandparents, believed that when you did have an earthquake or a hurricane, or you had great weather with a wonderful crop, that was God's activity behind that, bringing either on the bad things judgment on them for their sins, or blessings upon them for the good things that they did. And it was not just God, the spiritual force in the universe. It was Satan and angels and spirits and ghosts, a great deal of supernaturalism. And that was not just the Puritans. It was Catholics throughout Europe. It was Lutherans. It was Calvinists. All before the 18th century, that was very, very common in Europe. Actually, it was very, very common around the world. This world of activity of spirits causing things. But now we have Newton saying, well, look, in the natural world, with that's the speed of falling objects or water pressure or that sort of thing. There are natural explanations for this, and Newton did believe that God was behind this. But now Enlightenment thinkers are saying, no, that's not necessarily God directing those things, and we don't explain this as God's judgment or God's blessing on us. We just explain this as that's just a law of how things work. And Enlightenment thinkers explain this as sort of like a machine working. Now, where is God in all of this? And here's the first really big implication for religion in the Enlightenment. What does God do in this situation? And it can be summed up with something we call deism. And there are sort of a lot of different kinds of deists, and they run across a spectrum in terms of how deistic you may be or not be. But you describe the universe kind of in their mind, kind of like a machine, that God does not intervene. The laws of the universe just operate. And God is present. God created the universe, but then he just kind of sits back and watches it go. God's retired. He goes to Florida and wears shorts and plays golf and gets the early bird special at Denny's. He's just not that active anymore. He created the world, set it in, and now watches over it. That has huge implications for religion if you take that view of things. Because if that's true, well then, what about the incarnation or the atonement, which is God's active activity in the world, God becoming human being, or the resurrection? For many deists, they're like, that is not how the universe works. And because look, science, or how they interpret science and then apply it to religion and so forth. All right, so let's go back to our two characters here, Benjamin Franklin and Jonathan Edwards, and see how they react to this thing. Both of them, as young men, read the great Enlightenment thinkers of their day, which were just coming into great popularity in the 1720s and 30s when they were young. Franklin, first of all, Franklin embraced it. Franklin embraced the Enlightenment thinkers and said, yes, this is how the world operates. And so Franklin still believed in God, but God was an impersonal God. He was distant. He was up in the world. He went back and forth in his life, Ben Franklin did, about whether God intervenes at all or how much. But at any rate, it was always very, very, very scaled back for Benjamin Franklin. God was pretty much the creator of the universe, kind of watched over large scale events and directed them in a general way, but individually or in sort of a warm-hearted spirituality, no, that's not really what God was about. And Franklin kind of had this way of thinking even when he was young. There's a story about when he was young, and his father, who was this devout Puritan, would pray these prayers before the meal that went on and on and on. Some of us maybe can sympathize with that when we were little kids. And Franklin's solution was, he told his dad, look, why do we have to pray before the meal every single time? You get the cask of fish at the beginning of the week, just say one prayer over it and be done for the whole week. It's, number one, a pragmatic, practical look at prayer, but it's also, if you think about it, kind of a mechanical, mechanistic view of prayer, that prayer is about, just making this prayer for God to, bless it. You pray, God reacts. And there's not sort of a question of, wait a minute, does this do something in my heart? Like, is it increase my own thankfulness and gratitude, or my own sense of there is a God that is active? So even as a young man, Franklin was that way. But later on, as an older man, he wrote a number of things that demonstrated this view of prayer in a more fully developed way. Let me give you an example. When England was at war with France, and at this time, of course, the American colonies were English. This was England. And there was a big battle taking place up off coast of Newfoundland, Benjamin Franklin had something to say about prayer and people who were praying for this. And he makes, in kind of this slightly tongue-in-cheek sort of way, this point in 1740, some seem to think that forts are easily taken as snuff. Well, you have a fast and a prayer day in which I compute that, there are 500,000 petitions offered up to the same effect in New England. Well, if every family in New England had prayed for victory twice a day since January 25th, that would amount to 45 million prayers, which, set against the prayers of a few priests in the fort, to the Virgin Mary, those French Catholics, so forth, give a vast balance in your favor. If you do not succeed, and this is where Franklin's being a little snarkier, look, if you don't succeed, I fear I shall have but an indifferent opinion of Presbyterian prayers in such cases, as long as I live. I wonder whether your prayers really make a difference. Indeed, in attacking strong towns, I should have more dependence on works than on faith. Franklin is like looking at prayer in the same way that Isaac Newton looked at gravity. You can kind of measure it, and you get the desired result. And if you don't get the desired result, then it's not really right. And, he's just looking at prayer as something that affects the world out there. There's no question about what does this do to me inwardly or something like that. So that's that scientific revolution shaping Franklin's view of things there. And Franklin, then, in his view of Christianity, yes, he believed in God, but he does not believe in the Trinity. He said Jesus became God, and he didn't talk much about it because, well, he wanted people to buy his newspapers. But in private letters, he said, no, I can't believe in the Trinity. I can't believe that Jesus was God. And the Holy Spirit, that was just way too, old ways of thinking in this kind of supernatural world we used to live in. And so if Jesus was not God, what does that mean for the cross? And what does that mean for the resurrection? So there are implications there for questions of, all sorts of theological questions. I should point something out. We're all deists in some way. Even those of us who believe in the Trinity, believe in God having this spiritual impact on our lives, maybe on our hearts in some sort of way, believe that our sins have to be covered by God's grace, and God actively forgives us and reconciles us and transforms us. Even those of us that are that way have a little bit of deism. And here's where it comes out in other areas of the world. So to test this out, I sometimes ask my class, I say, is God in this classroom? And they'll say, well, yeah. I said, how do you know? Well, because God is everywhere. Okay. And I say, what's he doing? And they say, and they hem and haw around a little bit. And somebody said, well, he's watching over us. Sounds like Benjamin Franklin to me. And I say, isn't he doing more than that? And then I suggest that maybe actually God is working, but not in a supernatural way, and maybe not in a way that you necessarily feel all warm and fuzzy, but maybe he's helping you think more clearly. Maybe he's prodding you to pay attention. Maybe he's going to bring some insight to you. Maybe he will help you listen and put down your pride and listen to somebody else carefully. There's all sorts of ways he could be at work. And there's also ways that we could resist him. But it's not a natural sort of way we think, because this sort of Enlightenment thinking about this world operating like a machine has really seeped into our culture really pretty deeply, so that even many devout Christians will have God working in their heart, maybe a few times, kind of maybe almost miraculous thing, I don't know, healing it, depending on which Protestant or Catholic group you belong to. But generally we sort of assume that, without thinking about it, that we don't think about him acting in any other ways. It's the influence of Benjamin Franklin. Well, not the influence of Benjamin Franklin. It's really the influence of Enlightenment thinkers, and Franklin is one example. Okay, what about Jonathan Edwards? Well, Jonathan Edwards went off to college and read all of this. In fact, he read John Locke at the age of 17 and wrote about him. And scholars say he understood the Enlightenment thinkers better than some of the best philosophers in England at that time. Jonathan Edwards was really very, very intelligent. And he realized that the Enlightenment posed some serious questions for Christian faith, and especially his Calvinism, his Reformed theology that he inherited from his parents. And he wrestled with this for a while and thought, how can I reconcile this with God's sovereignty and this, as we oftentimes know, sort of predestination is one way that God's sovereignty comes out. And then and Jonathan Edwards concluded something very different than most other Enlightenment thinkers of his day. As he was thinking about Newton and science, Enlightenment, and so forth, he came to the conclusion that God is even more sovereign than what he thought. And here's how Edwards thought. To him, it hit him. God is a personal God, which means not only that he can come and move in my heart, but that actually, if you look at the workings of nature that Newton and the other scientists talk about, and you look at these laws, that is God at work. And not only is God at work like causing and holding up, the laws of gravity and time and temperature and that sort of thing, but, and here's the kicker that I think is really important for us. He said all of creation is a communication from God to us. It's of how God loves us and cares for us. That we ought to be thankful for these laws of science, because it enables us to flourish and to live. It's love. And not only that, there's beauty in that. And so this is God personally at work for us, not just in feeling warm sort of transformation in our heart, but in looking at the universe around us, which is something that, I think I could use a lot more of that. I think I'd be a lot happier during the day if I said, oh, the good things about, the nature around me that I see, not only nature, but the things human beings create, my cell phone, pizza, those are blessings to us. And God is working through human beings to create those things and make them. Realizing also that we live in a fallen world. And so even the weather can be destructive in the fallen world in some mysterious sort of way. And today we realize even human beings can contribute and have been and are contributing to greater destruction in weather and climate and so forth. So there's one difference between Edwards and Franklin. Franklin with God being an impersonal God, and Edwards being God, a personal God, not just in the heart, but in all of creation. God speaking to us. There are some other aspects of Edwards and Franklin that I'm just going to touch on, but not go into more depth. But I'll just mention that Franklin viewed life as sort of one about self-fulfillment. His autobiography of being a self-made man, and his moral theory was, there is sin, but if you're really pretty good, you can conquer that sin, and so you can calculate out. You don't have to listen to, all those old theological things. You can calculate out, is this action going to hurt other people? And then just don't do it. And work on disciplining yourself. He was about self-discipline. Edwards was very different, more traditional Christian view that we need to make God's will our own will, which I think is how one way we really need to understand the Lord's Prayer when we say, thy will be done. And Edwards says you need to have eternity in mind, where we are heading towards union for Christ, where Franklin did believe in heaven, but he was pretty much focused on this world and very little else. And again, you can see both of these trends in America today. One more thing about Franklin and that sinners in the hands of an angry God thing. Edwards believed in hell, but he didn't actually preach about it all that much. His sermons on hell, there's just a few handful. He preached far, far more about love and beauty. And that while we deserve hell, God is so loving. This is the thing we need to understand. God is calling us to this world of love, and our loves need to be directed in a in a proper sort of way. We need to love the right things in the right way. That's what he mostly prayed about. So, for instance, or wrote about and preached about. He could preach in a document that actually was far, in the 100 years after Edwards died, far better known than Sinners in the Hands of Angry God. He published something called Advice to Young Converts. And he has this tender sort of view in here. Walk with God and follow Christ as a little poor helpless child, taking hold of Christ's hand, keeping your eye on the mark of the wounds on his hands and side whence came the blood that cleanses you from sin. Taking hold of Christ's hand and walking with him. That's a little different than, God holds you like a spider over the fire. There's this other side of Edwards that we don't get oftentimes. One of his more famous documents, the personal narrative, where is kind of like his autobiography. He does talk about, what we would, sin and sinfulness. It comes up 9 times. He talks about wicked, corruption, defilement 9 times. He talks about hell or damnation 5 times. But how about this? Grace appears 8 times. Love appears 21 times. Delight, joy, happiness, enjoyment, sweetness 59 times. You've got like 23 times when he mentions the sin and this thing we don't talk about or not sure what to do with hell. But overall, you've got more than 80 times when he's talking about love and joy and happiness. So there's another side to Edwards that we often miss. All right, one more important difference between the two, and that comes with a very, very important event that takes place in the 18th century in the American colonies. And it's something called the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening was a series of revivals that occurred not only all through the American colonies, the 13 colonies, actually even in what is today the colonies in Canada, like Nova Scotia, but also in England and Scotland. And this occurred when Franklin and Edwards were young men in their 30s and 40s. Edwards actually led a revival in Connecticut. And that's when he preached Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And the last part of the sermon was not about God's damnation, but God is wanting to bring you this love and joy. Anyway, so this revival is led by the way, Presbyterian ministers are some of the first that lead these revivals, but there's a key figure in all of this. A man who arrives who becomes very famous through the whole business, and that is a man called George Whitefield. And George Whitefield, who lived in England, came to the colonies and was an incredibly successful, brilliant speaker and revivalist preacher. People said he could make people cry just by saying Mesopotamia. I've never made people cry when I've said that. Sometimes they giggle a little bit. Anyway, I don't know if Whitefield really did make them cry, but people talked about how really stunned they were by his preaching, how effective he was. There was one woman who in Philadelphia who heard him preach. She came and she broke down crying, and she sort of, Whitefield's goal was to get people to make this commitment to a new birth. What later people would call be born again. And this woman, like many other people, cried out and essentially said, yes, I need this new birth. Here's the thing. She didn't speak English. She was a German immigrant. And yet Whitefield affected her that much. I think she knew basically what Whitefield was talking about, but his speaking was so dramatic that she converted. Well, Whitefield generated enormous excitement throughout the colonies where he went. He didn't hit every colony, and he took several trips, as you can see, all the way from the southern colonies all the way up through the mid-Atlantic colonies to New England. And he is often considered the first celebrity in America. People knew about him before he arrived in town, and they anticipated greatly that he would be coming and got very, very excited about that. And huge crowds would show up, and he would speak to thousands of people. And he was an individual that was known by so many people throughout the colonies. They knew about him before he came. Do you know why? Because newspapers would publish reports about his revivals and say, he's coming to our town. And you know who published this? Benjamin Franklin was one of them. And Benjamin, and here's another interesting thing. Benjamin Franklin and George Whitefield got to be friends. Actually, they helped each other out in many ways. Benjamin Franklin knew that he'd sell a lot more newspapers if he wrote about George Whitefield. And George Whitefield was happy for the publicity. Yes, talk about me before I come. Talk about me in my revivals while I'm here. To be fair to Franklin, Franklin also liked the revivals. He thought, this is good for people. Do I need this revival? No. I'm a moral person. I figured out. But a lot of other people, they need this kind of religion to be good moral people, and I want people to be good moral people. And so we have, Franklin and Whitefield actually spending a lot of time together when they came to Philadelphia. Franklin has a couple of interesting sort of accounts about Whitefield and his speaking. He talks about going to hear him speak, and suddenly Whitefield starts to talk about taking up a collection of money for orphans. He'd start up an orphanage in Georgia, and Franklin's like, oh, these preachers, I'm not going to give him any money. They're always asking for money. And then he heard Whitefield speak, and he said, well, oh yeah, the orphans, maybe so, I'll throw in a couple of pennies. And then he listened to him speak a little more and said, well, actually, those orphans really are really pretty bad. I'll do more than a couple of coppers. I'll put in, some other coin there too. And then he listened to Whitefield a little bit more, and he just emptied his pockets, gave him all the money that he had. And, Franklin writes this to, kind of poke fun at himself, but also talk about what a great speaker Whitefield is. There's a point at which Whitefield is speaking in Philadelphia outside, and there's this huge crowd that gathers, and Whitefield's talking about their sins and how they need to commit their lives to Christ and so forth. And Franklin's in the crowd, and is Franklin thinking, gee, should I commit my life to Christ? No. You know what Franklin's thinking? Franklin's thinking, gosh, there's a lot of people here. I wonder if I can mathematically calculate how many people are here. And he can. And so he looks, Whitefield speaking at a corner, and you have to picture 4 streets coming together at this intersection, and it's kind of like a circle with 3/4 of a pie. And Franklin moved to the edge of the circle where he could just barely still hear Whitefield. And then he calculated the distance from where he was standing to the point where Whitefield was. That's kind of like the radius of the circle. And then he calculated how many people could be in a square feet. And then he calculated, he took pi r square and that's the number in the circle. And you take out a 4 for the pi part that was the building that Whitefield is. And Whitefield came out, or Franklin came out, 20,000 people. Whitefield could speak to 20,000 people. So that's Whitefield and Benjamin Franklin. And George Whitefield kept trying to convert Benjamin Franklin, and Franklin would smile and say thanks, but no thanks, I'm not going to do that. But there's another weird, or I don't know about weird, but interesting thing. They actually talked about cooperating together to settle Ohio. Why don't we go together and figure out how to bring people to Ohio? And Franklin says, you can handle the religious side of things, and I'll handle everything else, the civic institutions and that sort of thing. Anyway, it was an interesting dream. What would that have been like? Benjamin Franklin and George Whitefield settling Ohio? Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, Whitefield went on up and met Jonathan Edwards up in Connecticut. And of course, Edwards was a great supporter of the Great Awakening and of George Whitefield. And this movement, which spread through the colonies, really energized religion in the American colonies in a lot of different ways, and created or helped build what becomes known as the word that we have is evangelicalism. Now, I just got to stop and say one last thing about evangelicalism, because that word, what in the world does it mean? And there's all kinds of things that people think of when they think of evangelicalism. Is it a conservative Protestant? Is it someone who says they're born again? Is it somebody from a non-mainline denomination? Is it somebody who takes the Bible literally? Somebody who believes in God and country? Or is it just a religious person who votes for Trump? it has a lot of definitions, and the definitions are shifting these days. And here's what's, you want to know what's really odd about what it means to be evangelical and how the definitions are shifting. In the last couple of years, you not only have people who never go to church and don't really pray regularly and not devout calling themselves evangelical, but you have Catholics calling themselves evangelical and Mormons calling themselves evangelical, and, ready, Muslims and Hindus in America calling themselves evangelical. I think for those people, they're like, I support this conservative political movement and that God is in that and that's religious. Okay, that's what I would call maybe, or God, I'm religious, I support a movement that's religious, and so it's like God and country. Historically, though, that's not what George Whitefield or Jonathan Edwards was all about. So historians say, if you really want to go back and look at this movement over time, it's the branch of Protestantism, and it's not bound by any denomination. That's part of what makes it confusing. And you can see this with Whitefield preaching in all kinds of different churches and to people from all kinds of different traditions. But what holds them in common, a need for a personal decision to commit your life to Christ, that's the new birth, an emphasis on Christ's atonement, Christ's blood on the cross. You pound that very, very hard. The authority of the Bible, but then also evangelism or missionary work. I think historically that's the best working definition of evangelicalism that seems to capture what this movement is about. But in recent years, it's taking on other sort of connotations and meanings that are really something different. But the First Great Awakening, since this sort of revivalistic movement in motion in the American colonies, and that'll last for quite some time. So, Franklin Edwards. Franklin is still more famous, maybe more popular, and maybe, you know, more Americans are similar to Benjamin Franklin than they are to Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, though, captures some religious aspects that a lot of Americans hold to, and I should also mention, in his theology, which I didn't get to, there are still theologians today that find things in his theology like, oh my gosh, this is something we really, why don't we emphasize this? Like, you can see God's beauty in nature. And there's a whole other things about how he thinks about sin and thinking and the human will, which is complicated. That's a story maybe for another day. Franklin, or Edwards has his own sort of significance, though he's not famous as Ben Franklin is, and maybe he shouldn't be. If you're interested more in Ben Franklin, one last point, I'll just point out that you can read, this is a great book by George Marsden, A Short Life of Jonathan Edwards. It's a great summary, it's very readable, and it's one I assigned to my class. It's a great sort of introduction to him. If you really, really want the heavy stuff, George Marsden wrote a full-blown biography. This is, instead of, 180 pages, this is like 500, or I don't know, 600 pages, and really gets into the in-depth. It won the Bancroft Prize, which is the highest prize you can get as a historian for American history. So it's anyway, if you want the heavy stuff, this is a good biography. If you want just a nice introduction, then there's this. All right, Edwards, Franklin, and American culture. Ever since then, they both have had an impact on it. Someday, maybe we'll be in a situation where we can, if you have questions, you can talk to me about it, or we can talk a little bit longer about these sort of things. But thanks for staying with me today. I've gone over a minute or two. I hope you're not upset by that. But, okay, until next week, thank you very much.